Hey everyone, Aaron Philbeck here at Chi Association. I am pleased to be joined by Charles Hyde, who is the head of asset allocation for New Zealand's superannuation fund. And Charles was both part of the original total portfolio approach paper that we released last year, as well as participated in this follow up piece as well. So, really excited to dive into a conversation with you, Charles, and thanks for spending some time with me.
No, great to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. Well, so Charles, in this second paper that we are working on together, we've taken the conceptual framework that we introduced in the first TPA paper and are much more focused on the practicalities of how you transition from a strategic asset allocation framework to a total portfolio approach framework. So trying to get into some of the nitty gritty of what that looks like. So maybe just a first question for you is around that transition from your seat and how that started at NZ Super. And I guess in your mind, what is the most important first step for those who are trying to make that transition from SAA over to TPA?
Yeah, sure. So we set out on our journey way back in 2010 when we adopted a reference portfolio. And that was really, for us, I think, the most important catalyst towards adopting a total portfolio approach, and indeed, in many ways, the foundation of it. So we adopted a reference portfolio, and at that time, the board agreed that it made sense for the board to focus going forward on governance and for management to take ownership of the investing. And that might sound kind of simple and obvious, but a lot of places don't have that clarity of division of labor, if you like, between governance and management, and that great clarity that we have, and that was put in place at that time that we adopted the reference portfolio, which is a governance mechanism, has really been the foundation of our total portfolio approach. It gave great clarity to us as to who owns what, but it also importantly gave management the flexibility to take an approach to building a portfolio and managing it that is different from what you would typically see out there under that rubric of the SAA approach. It allowed us to be more dynamic in terms of the way that we manage the portfolio. We didn't have to engage with the board with every investment decision along the way. And it also freed us from some of the constraints of the SAA approach. So we weren't tied to using the kind of classical standard asset class definitions that you would see in an SAA. And it also allowed us to get away from that idea of having a fixed cycle of asset allocation reviews, every year or 2 years or whatever it is. It allowed us to kind of to return to the allocations on a much more frequent basis. So that was the beginning of our total portfolio journey. But that was, as I said, 15 years ago. It's certainly by no means the end of our journey. It's been very much a work in progress over a long period of time. There have been some meaningful changes to the way that we've done things since then. We adopted a risk budgeting approach in 2014 or so, which was a big step forward. And so, going back to that split between governance and management, our board retained two key investment decisions. One is the structure of the reference portfolio. What combination of asset classes should we have in that? And they also own the sizing of our active risk budget that management has to use to build a better portfolio. So, we've I guess done a lot of things along the way to enhance collaboration and maximize, if you like, the efficiency with which we share information within the fund, and more generally trying to build a culture that underpins that need to have strong collaboration across the teams within the fund. And lastly, one of the bigger projects that we've been working on over the last few years is building out our capability around providing the decision makers with timely, quality information about the different assets in our portfolio and their relative attractiveness, so that we can maintain that competitive tension in the portfolio through time.
So Charles, there's a lot there, and I want to come back on a couple of those points. But your comment on kind of the accountability and the governance structure that's put in place, I think, was one of the biggest aha moments for us as we were going through this second study of that implementation phase. And it seemed like no matter what type of organization or what type of portfolio you were managing, if you truly wanted to go from that SAA framework to a TPA framework, it really started with that governance and the accountability, and, to use your phrase, division of labor between the governing body and the investment team. So reinforces, I think, a lot of what you just said. I want to talk a little bit about that kind of trade-off of flexibility that is afforded to the investment team by the governing body with risk management. And in some ways, it's liberating to have the board kind of take a hands-off approach to the day-to-day management. You no longer have the prescriptive asset classes that you mentioned, and you can operate in a much more fluid environment instead of those regular reset periods that you mentioned. But on the other hand, it kind of removes some of those risk management components that naturally come with an SAA type of framework. So could you talk a little bit through how you think about risk management with a reference portfolio as a guide versus a more prescriptive SAA type of asset allocation that's being effectively handed to you by that governing body?
Yeah. So I think in many ways, we ask similar questions to probably most other funds out there when it comes to thinking about risk management. It's just that we go about it in a different way. So yeah, our reference portfolio is the foundation of our portfolio, mostly because it sets the risk profile of our portfolio. The purpose of the reference portfolio at its simplest is to convey to management what the board's risk appetite is. And we, management, are required to manage the portfolio at a risk level that's consistent with that reference portfolio. So, but I guess I would say as far as the reference portfolio part of it is concerned, because obviously for us, asset allocation has two pieces. One is the design of the reference portfolio, and the other is our active risk budgeting that we do. And that's where we get into a more granular asset allocation work, which is more akin, you might say, to an SAA approach. But as far as the reference portfolio is concerned, I guess for us, we have, by design, kept our reference portfolio very simple. It only has two asset classes: global equities and global fixed income, with a small allocation to New Zealand equities within that equity allocation. And so it's simple, but that has the advantage, I think, of bringing greater clarity to our risk conversations. We're not getting kind of burdened down by the complexity of a portfolio that looks more like what you would have, say, in an SAA approach. And so for us, we come to that reference portfolio asking, how do we ensure that reference portfolio is fit for purpose in terms of meeting our mandate? So, we have a mandate which is given to us by the government. We are a sovereign wealth fund. And so our primary purpose, as I said, the reference portfolio is an expression of the board's risk appetite. So our primary purpose, as far as risk management goes for the reference portfolio, is to ensure that we minimize the risks of not meeting our mandate. So yes, the usual kinds of risk questions, which are about, how big of a left tail return can you withstand, or are you willing to withstand? How big of a drawdown Are you willing to tolerate? Those are very important questions for us. But equally, we are focused on, well, how low of a return over the medium to long term is the board willing to tolerate? So for us, not taking on enough risk is a risk in itself, because if we only have a small allocation to equities in that reference portfolio, we're more or less locking in a low return over the long term. And that doesn't really square with our mandate, which requires us to maximize return without undue risk. So, we're taking a very balanced approach to thinking about risk. It's about, how much equity risk can we take on without getting into uncomfortable territory in terms of drawdowns, but also, what's the lower limit on how much equity risk we're able to take without undermining our ability to deliver on our mandate. So it is very much a balancing act. And we actually survey our board with very direct questions as to these various aspects of risk around the reference portfolio to try to get a sense from them as to where their risk tolerance lies. And obviously, the board changes over time. You get new members coming on, others rolling off. And even for those that have been on the board for some time, they are actually quite difficult questions to answer. If someone asks you what's your minimum, what's the minimum return that you're willing to generate over a period of time, but they are the really the cornerstone questions that we ask ourselves when it comes to thinking about the reference portfolio. The other thing that's probably worth mentioning is that while we design the reference portfolio as a separate exercise, we don't do that in isolation of the portfolio that we're running. So there are certain design features of that reference portfolio that actually will flow on to affect the actual portfolio that we are running in the fund. So, for example, in the past, we have always hedged the portfolio to mirror the hedging policy in the reference portfolio. Well, that brings liquidity considerations to bear in the actual portfolio. And so we have them in mind when we're setting, say, the hedge ratio or the currency exposure of the reference portfolio. So it's a holistic approach that we bring. We are designing a reference portfolio. It is our benchmark. So, as I said, it's a governance mechanism, but we don't do it in ignorance of what some of the flow-on effects of those decisions will be. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the risk budgeting that we do, which is to say, taking the risk budget that the board have given us, which is currently a 4% tracking error relative to the reference portfolio, that's the other key asset allocation exercise that we engage in. And that's at a much more granular level. And it takes into account, liquidity constraints, obviously the size of the risk budget that we have to work with, and any other, relevant constraints around particular asset classes or sub-asset classes that we're getting into. And so that's kind of a bit closer to what you might think of as a more standard SAA approach to allocation.
So, Charles, I want to pick up on that last point, which is the portfolio and how the portfolio has changed over this journey. So, starting back in 2010 all the way to present, talk through how, as you've gone through this journey from SAA to TPA, what have the trends been within the portfolio in terms of asset classes that you may have invested in that you no longer do invest in, or new asset classes or strategies that have been introduced as a result of moving towards TPA? And then maybe a follow-on to that is the relationships that you've built and partnerships you've built with the external managers that you utilize, and how have those changed over time?
Okay, so as I said earlier, we've been on this journey for 15 years. So the pre and post it wasn't a big bang where you can kind of easily say, okay, this is what it looked like before and this is what it looked like after. It's something it's been a slow burn, you could say, and it's evolved over time. But I guess if I had to point to one thing that changed, and it did change at right around the time that we adopted the reference portfolio construct, which I said earlier was, I think, the foundation of our total portfolio approach and the delegations associated with that, the changes, was that we adopted what we call our strategic tilting program, which is an internal DAA program that we run. And so that was adopted essentially to allow us to tilt around the major asset classes through time in a fairly dynamic fashion. We have this. We now have this reference portfolio, which we only review every 5 years, so it's fairly fixed in time. But in accordance with our desire to be more dynamic, we needed something like the strategic tilting program to allow us to move the portfolio around as the attractiveness of different asset classes waxed and waned. So that was a key difference to our portfolio pre and post, and I think it remains something that's fairly distinctive for our fund, partly because of its performance, which has been quite exceptional, but also, and perhaps also, the fact that we're willing to size it at the level that we do. So it does take up a good portion of our active risk budget, and so I think it's quite distinctive in that way. And I guess the performance and the sizing are not unrelated. It's something that we started off small. As it proved itself up, we got more comfortable with it, and we were willing to allocate more risk to it. But I think my take is that if we were still running a more traditional approach, we probably wouldn't have got to the point where we've given it the allocation that we have. And the way I think about it is that in a more typical SAA approach, you'd make an allocation to all of the major asset classes. You'd make an allocation to alternatives. Then within that alternatives allocation, you'd kind of sub-allocate to a number of different things, global macro and maybe some trend and whatever else. Whereas we allocate directly to strategic tilting along with a lot of other things. So our allocation occurs directly at a more granular level in that risk budgeting exercise that we do. So that, I think, is certainly one thing that stands out for me as being quite a big difference pre and post implementation of our total portfolio approach. The other thing that happened when we did make that change was that we went through and kind of cleaned out the portfolio. So we actually terminated a lot of strategies and managers, which we just felt that when we looked at it from that total portfolio perspective, there just wasn't a strong kind of rationale for how all of that fitted together. And so we got rid of quite a few hedge fund strategies, and we terminated quite a few managers at that time. And there was a real focus for a while on having what we used to refer to as fewer, deeper manager relationships, and really just kind of consolidating the portfolio down to something that was more coherent, you could say. So that was another change. There was a real kind of clean out of the portfolio in the first few years after adopting the reference portfolio and total portfolio approaches. The other thing that was notable, I think distinctive, was that we were more comfortable not necessarily having all asset classes represented in our portfolio. And this goes back to that idea that, you want to have competitive tension in your portfolio, and you want to be including those things that are attractive, and being willing to not include things that are not attractive. So, for example, there was a period there when, for a few years, when we didn't have any real estate to speak of in our portfolio, which I think you would agree is quite distinctive, makes it a distinctive portfolio relative to most of our peers. Although, that said, as we've grown in size, we acknowledge that it becomes harder and harder to pivot into and out of a whole asset class through time. So there are some things you can do in a total portfolio approach when you're small that you can't do when you're large. And I'm not saying by any means that we're large on the global scale, but the way that we think about the total portfolio approach, I think, is slightly different from the way that some of our peers think about it, who are much larger and who just can't kind of do the things that we do, because we are, after all, still a relatively small player on the global stage. But I think really at the end of the day, it's more about the mentality that we bring with the total portfolio approach. So, instead of just asking the simple question, does this new investment clear its or beat its cost of capital, we're much more cognizant of how does this new investment fit into the puzzle of our broader portfolio? How does it impact on our tail risk? How does it impact in particular on the liquidity risk that we have? And how diversifying is it as an alpha source, say, relative to the other alpha sources we have? What are the factor exposures that it brings, and how does that align with what we're trying to achieve from a total portfolio perspective?
Wonderful. Well, Charles, I really appreciate your time and walking through some of these additional questions and case studies. And again, appreciate your contribution both to the original piece that we put out last year and then being part of this follow-up piece. I think the industry is going to benefit from your expertise and learning a little bit more about how you've made this transition over the past several years. So thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Aaron. Thanks for having me.